Boa tarde, aqui é Brian Mir. Hoje eu vou entrevistar um economista importante dos Estados Unidos chamado Mark Weisbrot. Mark Weisbrot é um dos diretores do Center for Economic and Policy Research em Washington, D.C. É um instituto de pesquisa econômico que tem entre seus conselheiros o premiado do Nobel da Economia, Alfred Stiglitz. Mark é um frequente contribuidor para os grandes jornais da língua inglesa, como New York Times, The Guardian, e às vezes ele escreve também para a Folha do São Paulo e outros jornais nas Américas. Então, sem mais falar em português, eu vou conversar com Mark agora. Mark, welcome to our show. It's nice to talk to you.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks for having me.
Okay, I invited you to talk today because you've made a couple interviews recently that I heard on the radio and on Real News talking about the rolling back of the pink tide in Latin America. So what is the pink tide and how is it being rolled back?
Well, beginning in 1998, when Chavez was elected in Venezuela, you had a whole series of elections of left governments in Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, Ecuador, Bolivia, then Nicaragua, El Salvador. And it became really that the left governed the majority of people in Latin America by 2010 or so. And then it began to be rolled back. But during that time, I mean, a lot of progress was made. Poverty from 2003 to 2013, poverty was reduced in the region from 44 to 28%. And if you go through the various countries, there were all kinds of accomplishments that had not been achieved. You got to remember that the poverty rate actually increased for the 20 years prior to this pink tide. And so this was a major change. It was coming out of a huge economic failure from 1980 to 2000, where the per capita income of the region barely grew at all. It grew about 9%, as opposed to more than 90% from 1960 to 1980. So this was a huge economic failure, kind of an unprecedented one almost in the history of modern capitalism, to have this long period of economic failure. And that's not even mentioning what happened in terms of inequality. This is just the collapse of economic growth. So I think that's in large part what drove this electoral earthquake, and also the fact that they finally were able to do it. You know, when Chavez ran for office in 98, he didn't even want to do it because he thought that, like most of the left, that it really wasn't possible for left organizations and movements to come to power through the ballot box. And then it became true for the first time in, ever really in Latin American history.
Okay, and but how is this? Okay, so that describes the pink tide, but how is the pink tide now being rolled back, in your opinion? Why is the left losing so many governments in Latin America, as it has been for the last couple of years now?
Well, I think the story is different in each country. There isn't. The media has this kind of simple story that there was a commodities boom, and that's what led to all the social and economic progress during the first decade of the 21st century. And I think that's grossly oversimplified, and it's not even true in most cases. Obviously, in Venezuela or Ecuador, whether you have big oil exports or hydrocarbon exports are a big part of the government's revenue that was enabled some of the changes to take place, but really it was policy changes that allowed for it. And so, and these left governments made these policy changes. In Brazil, for example, also they increased public investment. They took a number of measures They increased spending on, as you know, on the Bolsa Familia program, but mostly they increased employment, they increased the minimum wage, and they increased economic growth as well, and that was partly fiscal and monetary policy in this period. But how did it get reversed? I think that the economic slowdown, the world economic slowdown after 2010, made some difference. It wasn't the main thing. I think that in most of the countries there were policy changes that were, I think, a mistake. You had that in Brazil, beginning when the economy went into recession, the first quarter of 2014. There were, and even before that, there were a number of policies changes that the government shouldn't have made, primarily in macroeconomic policy, raising interest rates when they shouldn't, cutting public investment and other spending when they shouldn't have. So I think that contributed to the climate that allowed the right to impeach Dilma without even accusing her of an actual crime, and of course the imprisonment of Lula and the other measures that they've taken. I think in Venezuela you also had before they went into recession before the collapse of oil prices, and you had much bigger policy mistakes there that eventually led to the hyperinflation that they have now. And that was primarily a failure of the exchange rate system that they had, and they held on to that even as they developed an inflation depreciation spiral. In other countries, I think it was, well, first of all, I want to say that in all of these countries, the United States played a role in getting rid of these governments, and that role varied. From the extreme case was Venezuela, where they tried to overthrow the government in 2002 by supporting a coup and actually being involved in that coup and funding the people who organized the coup and supporting efforts to at regime change for a really long time. But they also did things everywhere else. Here's a case where people don't even realize how much the U.S. did was Argentina. The U.S. government moved to block loans in the Inter-American Development Bank and the World Bank at a time when the Argentine government was facing balance of payments problems and therefore needed these loans. And then they, of course, immediately restored that when Macri took office in December of 2015, when they got the right-wing government that they wanted. And they did other things as well. The court decision in New York, which was a political decision, the judge didn't even try to hide it. He took over 90% of Argentina's creditors hostage and said that the government couldn't pay their bondholders until they paid these vulture funds. And that hurt them as well, because Argentina was really poised to return to international borrowing after a long time, more than a decade since their default back in 2001. So, and in every one, if you go country by country, and of course Honduras, the United States was supported that coup. Hillary Clinton even wrote in her memoirs that she made sure that she worked to ensure successfully that the democratically elected president, Mel Zelaya, would not be able to return to office. She actually wrote that. And so that, and then of course, they helped legitimize not only the coup, but then more recently in November, the stolen election of the National Party, which they helped bring to power in the 2009 coup. And you could go through all these countries, in Brazil as well, and you've written about this. the United States has played a role by showing its approval of the impeachment of Dilma. And that was important, I think, because that tells uh, people in Brazil, and especially the people who organized the coup, that they have the support of the United States for doing this. And that was demonstrated a number of times, most importantly, the day after the vote to impeach Dilma in the House. Um, the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in Brazil, who was a leader in the Senate of the move to impeach Dilma, he came to the United States and he met with Tom Shannon, who was at the time, this was 2016, and he was the he was the third ranking official in the entire U.S. State Department. And he was basically in charge of Latin America and a former ambassador to Brazil. And he made it by meeting with this senator.
His name was Alois.
Yeah. Yes. Nunez. And he met with him and he showed his approval of the coup by doing that at the particular moment. And then John Kerry came to Brazil in August, and he held a joint press conference with José Serra, who was the acting foreign minister because Dilma was not yet removed from office. And there was a Senate vote coming up. And there were times when that vote looked like it could be close. And in that press conference, he talked about how great the relationship with going forward, the relationship with Brazil was going to be. And that made it clear as well to any senators who had any doubts that the United States was going to be strongly behind the removal of Dilma from office. So these are, things that may or may not be determinative, but they're also generally the tip of the iceberg. We don't even know. For example, in Brazil, you have the U.S. Department of Justice participated in the whole investigation, the Lava Jato investigation, but other corruption investigations. And we don't really even know how much they did or how much they had to do with Judge Morrow's railroading and unjust imprisonment of Lula. There will be some people looking into that here. But again, these are the kind of things, as Lula himself said, it took, when he was asked about the U.S. role in any of this, he said, well, it took us 50 years to find out what the U.S. did in the coup in Brazil in 1964. So you can expect that there will be more in the future that we find out.
Okay. I read an article of yours recently. It was kind of a letter, an open letter to Tom Shannon, who was retiring from the State Department. Now, I think he's an interesting character because he's been involved in a lot of activities related to regime change in this process of rolling back the pink tide. But from what I understand, he worked in both Republican and Democratic administrations. Now, this brings me to a point an argument I get in a lot with my liberal friends in the United States. When I personally question how much difference there is between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party's policies in Latin America. Have you, in your analysis on this phenomenon of the rise and fall of the pink tide in Latin America, noticed very much qualitative difference in policy between the Democratic presidents like Bush, Republican presidents like Bush, and Democrats like Obama and Clinton and things like that?
I don't think you can distinguish between Obama and Bush in terms of their policies towards Latin America. Obama presided over the coup in Honduras, for example. And as I said, his Secretary of State did everything she could, and the administration did everything they could to make sure that that coup succeeded and established the government, which is really a dictatorship today since they stole that last election. And so that there was very little difference. I mean, the one difference you could say that Obama had on the positive side, and there were other things that happened, by the way, during the Obama administration that were at least as bad as things that Bush did. For example, there was a parliamentary coup in Paraguay in 2012 that was very similar to what happened to Dilma. And the U.S. government worked with the Organization of American States, worked within it to try to successfully make sure that coup was successful. So yeah, if you compare Obama to Bush, there's no difference except for the Cuba policy. And there, obviously it was a historic thing in some respects, since this embargo, well, they didn't even get rid of the embargo, but since this break in ambassadorial relations had gone on for 50 years, it was significant in some ways, but it wasn't really a change in strategy. It was quite obvious, if you followed the events, that this was just a change in tactics. That is, for decades, most of the elite in this country, the entire business class, wanted to get into Cuba and had recognized that the embargo had failed. And so what Obama was doing was just switching to a different means of regime change, which is to open up Cuba. So it wasn't really any big policy change. It was more a change of tactics and strategy. And so other than that, you couldn't really argue that Obama's positions in Latin America were really different than those of George W. Bush. Now, Trump is, I think, significantly different because he is, he's a different animal altogether. He doesn't respect any of the norms of international diplomacy. So he did ask his staff, his cabinet, if he could take military action to overthrow the Venezuelan government. They've openly supported a military coup, which the previous 16 years they didn't actually do that openly, even though they funded the people who carried out the 2002 coup attempt. And so that's qualitatively different. And I think that's not because Trump cares about Latin America. None of them made it a big priority. I think it's because of Marco Rubio. He has a deal with Marco Rubio, and Marco Rubio, the senator from Florida, is kind of in charge of most Latin America policy now. And so it is more extremist rather than representing the mainstream of the foreign policy apparatus, which includes, it's a complex ship. It's 17 intelligence agencies, the State Department, the National Security Council, the Foreign Policy Committees of Congress, and the Pentagon. And so when you talk about these administrations, that's really what you're talking about, especially in Latin America, because it doesn't have that much electoral consequences here, and therefore the presidents tend to go with what the rest of the foreign policy apparatus wants.
Okay. I'm going to just ask one more question because we're running out of time, but I'd like to ask your opinion about the role that the big media companies play in naturalizing regime change in Latin America, and especially with regards to this process where country after country is suffering from right-wing takeovers and massive austerity programs that are driving up poverty, infant mortality, deaths during maternity, hunger. Brazil's about to return to the hunger map. And we see papers like the New York Times almost actively cheerleading for this entire process. And I'll give an example. There's an organization called ASCOA, America's Society Council of the Americas, which was founded by John Rockefeller in the 60s, that's been involved. It has a revolving door with the press. Their magazine's assistant editor just became a Latin America desk editor at the New York Times. Their chief editor wrote an article in Folha de São Paulo yesterday called "Why the Markets Are Cheerleading for a Bolsonaro Victory in the Presidential Elections." And Bolsonaro is a neo-fascist. So we have a private sector corporate think tank influencing content in media companies in favor of fascism in Brazil. What do you think about the role that this plays with this rolling back of the pink tide in the region?
Well, I don't think the New York Times, either their editorial board or their foreign policy reporters, would support Bolsonaro. They're more in the mainstream, and so that's outside of what they would support. But on the other hand, the mainstream is pretty horrible, and it is very much your broad point about the role of the media is correct. The media here on Latin America speaks almost monolithically with one voice on Latin America, and it's the same voice as foreign policy apparatus that I described, all the different agencies, the Pentagon and the intelligence agencies. It is different from other parts of the world where there's definitely a pro-U.S. government bias, but there are differences of opinion on policy in Afghanistan or Iraq, sometimes even Syria. In Latin America, you don't really see that kind of, you have almost no debate and almost no dissent. Obviously, this is something that's going on a real long time. I think partly it reflects the lack of differences of opinion within the government apparatus. And so you see this in the media, in the think tanks, in the foreign policy journals like Foreign Affairs. There's just very little. There's occasional dissent. Obviously, I've had pieces in the New York Times on Brazil and Argentina and other countries.
I wasn't talking about those pieces when I was complaining about the New York Times.
No. I'm saying that's that's an exception. But the reporting is, it goes through phases. It wasn't always quite this bad. This is a real low point right now. For instance, there were phases when you did see the major media go occasionally to academics who would give a positive view of the pink tide. They would have a little bit of balance, not anything that you or I would call balance, but some perfunctory attempt to provide the impression of balance. And they don't even have that much anymore. I guess there was some change. I mean, if you want to go into detail on it, there was a shift, for example, in U.S. reporting on Brazil after the impeachment of Dilma. It was such an ugly spectacle, as you remember. It shocked, I think, part of the international media, and they started to wonder about these people that they had kind of, with their reporting, supported in their ouster of the democratically elected government of Brazil. And so there was some change there. There are changes. I don't want to pretend that it's, there's no conspiracy here. It's just the reporting just overwhelmingly tends to follow the State Department and the government here when it comes to Latin America.
Okay. Mark Weisbrot, thanks a lot. Thanks for joining us today. It's been a very interesting discussion. All right. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks for having me. You too.
Thanks.
Nós vivemos em tempos muito estranhos e bicudos. Nesses tempos, é muito importante que as nossas opiniões surjam e apareçam. Daí que eu acredito que a imprensa, essa imprensa que nasce da base, essa imprensa democrática, essa imprensa que se esforça para sobreviver, seja apoiada. Por isso eu apoio o 247 na sua luta por sobreviver.